Okay, welcome everybody. It's on behalf of both the Kellogg Institute and the Kroc Institute for this jointly sponsored event. I can't tell you how much of a pleasure it is for me to be able to introduce my longtime and very dear friends to our Notre Dame community, Ambassador Susan Page. Ambassador Page is formerly the special representative and head of the UN Mission for Justice Support in Haiti. Before that, she served as Deputy Special Representative for the Rule of Law at the UN Stabilization Mission in Haiti. But she has many years of experience in diplomatic postings before that, included serving as the first US ambassador to South Sudan. She was the acting US ambassador to the African Union and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. She was a senior advisor in the Office of the United States Special Envoy for Sudan and South Sudan. She has many years of experience within the State Department and USAID in diplomatic and in legal positions, and has such a richness of experience to offer us. And I know all of us are really eager to hear from you. Susan, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm actually going to sit because I think I'm short. So I'm not so short wide, but I just wanted to say thank you very much. A big thanks to Paolo, who made this happen, and to Therese Hanlon for all of the spectacular arrangements. It's great to be here. I was mentioning that even though I just grew up in Chicago, not very far, I went to undergrad at University of Michigan. So I would never have stepped foot on this campus, but
we're forgiving.
A long time has passed since then. And academically, I would never have had a problem, but I'm a huge football fan. However, I did do a tour of campus yesterday, and I did see, the touchdown Jesus, and I did have to take a photo of that, because come on. So again, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming. I will say that the conversations that I had with some of the students gave me some new thoughts also about what I wanted to include in my talk. And I hope that you will ask questions during the question and answer period. I'm not going to speak a long time, but I thought I would just give some thoughts about South Sudan, which there's a saying, an idiom that they have, which is normally said in Arabic, but if you go to Sudan or Egypt, South Sudan, they say that if you have drunk from the Nile, you will always come back. So it is clearly still with me, and I can't get over all the experiences that I've had in Sudan and South Sudan. So I wanted to talk a little bit about first how I got involved in the Sudan peace process. So this is pre-independence. As Paolo had mentioned, at that point I had finished my, I guess about 10 years at the State Department, and my tour at that point, I'd been political officer responsible for also the human rights portfolio and the justice portfolio at the US Embassy in Kigali, Rwanda. And had gone to the UN, to UNDP. There was an opening there. I mean, some people ask, well, how did you get into the UN? And, a lot of these are things that you just can't plan for. It just, an opening happens, you happen to be at the right place at the right time, and, serendipity. And so they were looking for a new head of their Justice and Human Rights unit at UNDP in Kigali, and boom, I got the position. And so I was doing that. And like most new jobs, the first 6 months you're excited, it's new. And then the politics start kicking in, and you start realizing, the UN is a different animal altogether. But I was enjoying what I was working on, a lot of the human rights issues, constitutional development, etc. But my very first boss from the State Department called me and said, look, we are trying to help with this revitalized peace process for Sudan. And several of us in the State Department thought about you. You have negotiation experience, you know how to draft legal documents, you know Africa. I'm like, I don't know Sudan. He said, don't worry, you'll learn it. And I took the job. So I moved back to Nairobi, which is where the talks were going to be started, in June 1st of 2002, and reestablished myself in Kenya. And literally in a 2-week period before the first opening round began, I learned as much as I could about the history of the conflict, the war. At that point had been going on for about 19 or 20 years between the government in the north, and it was actually more than one rebel group, but sort of biggest one that was under an alliance umbrella of the National Democratic Alliance, but was the SPLM, the the Sudan People's Liberation Movement and Army. And so I learned about the Addis Ababa Agreement, which had ended the previous conflict in 1972, the gap of about 11 years where there had been reasonable peace, and tried to learn as much as possible about their constitution making, especially after the 1972 agreement, the splits within the SPLM, SPLA in 1991, and the country. So at that point, I had read some cables from, the State Department, because it was not that far away, Sudan, and a lot had been happening in that end period. But what I wanted to stress, even before I get to the actual negotiations, is just how important context is. It's context and it's timing. So just as we think, say about jobs and opportunities that come along, a lot of this is just stuff that happens that you can't plan for. And so when we think about what had happened, and now I have to go to my notes. In 2000 so let me go back. So when we think about the context, and especially Sudan, we have to remember that in June of 2002, when the rejuvenated peace process started, we were less than a year out from the 9/11 attacks. When I was doing some background research on this, we have to think about the Gulf War that began in 1991, the American peacekeepers being killed in Somalia in 1993, 1994, the genocide in Rwanda, same year, Srebrenica. So a lot of events had been happening that was changing a lot of our thinking about international affairs, international relations, peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping. Even the Somalia intervention was considered sort of a chapter 6.5 intervention. It was neither really chapter 6 nor completely chapter 7. Of course, there's no such thing as a chapter 6.5, but that's what, what we called it sort of on the legal scene in the State Department, that this was, well, wait, what exactly are we doing? But maybe you know or don't know, but Hassan Turabi, who was the architect of Sudan's sort of Islamic State and the revolutionary leader, during this time, Osama bin Laden had been living in Khartoum. Carlos the Jackal. So Al-Qaeda had already a presence, even if perhaps at that time we didn't know it as Al-Qaeda. And again, the US Embassy bombings in 1998 in Kenya and Tanzania. So all of this sort of led up to 2002, but again, I think the most recent at the time was 9/11 attacks in September of 2001. This actually presented a real opportunity for there to be an opportunity for peace in Sudan. It's Africa's longest running conflict, very vicious and violent. In the 20 years at that point, more than 2 million people had died, 4 million people had been displaced. What is not often talked about was that a lot of that killing, both during the Civil War, the Second Civil War, what we call, as well as even during peace times, including after South Sudan seceded and had independence, a lot of the violence was South-South violence, was violence against each other, against neighbor, against other ethnicity. But another opportunity was that, to a certain extent, that President George Bush said after the 9/11 attacks, quote, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." So that was our foreign policy tenet at the time. And combating terrorism became the new focus of US foreign policy. So we then had the US Patriot Act. And I remember thinking about this at the time, that the Patriot Act was not just, it's actually interesting thinking about it now in terms of the language. I'm a real patriot, and I'm a nationalist, and what does that mean? Which I will just mention here, but I would like to go back to it later. The whole notion of language and what language means, because words really have meaning. And words have meaning not just in whatever our native tongue is, but in the native tongue of the people that we are either negotiating with, mediating between, or discussing with. But when we think about the Patriot Act, the USA Patriot Act actually stands for the Uniting and Strengthening America by providing appropriate tools required to intercept and obstruct terrorism Act of 2001. So USA Patriot, every single letter had an actual meaning. So again, we sometimes forget about this, and it helps, it helps me also to keep me grounded and remind me of, well, how did we get here? There was a history before all of these events happened. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 didn't just happen. It wasn't just boom. There had been lots of things, not only leading up to it, but also in the history of Rwanda, from the colonial period, from the pre-colonial period, and all up to that period, and as well as afterwards. So what this did, of course, was that then as we started focusing more and more on search and surveillance and terrorism, FBI, other law enforcement agencies had new surveillance powers. All of this was very new technology at that time. And in November of the same year, the Taliban in Afghanistan fell to the Northern Alliance in the US. So fast forward, the peace process starts. We believe that we had a real opportunity to make peace because Sudan really wanted to get out from under US sanctions, economic sanctions, but they also wanted to get back into the good books of the United States, especially with these wars on terrorism. The peace process was done under the auspices of a regional organization called IGAD, which stands for the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Its headquarters are actually based in Djibouti, but they had created a separate secretariat for peace in Sudan, based in Nairobi, with its own special legal authorities and status. So 2002, we go through the opening and everything goes along. We go out to Machakos and the peace process starts in earnest with negotiating, trying to negotiate sort of on a framework. I think what makes the Sudan peace process so unique at the time, this is 2002, so it's now been quite some time, was that we used kind of old-fashioned methods of, wait for it, listening to people. And we didn't have all the smart technology, but we had just regular flip charts And we, in plenary, would go around and talk about the topics that seem to most trouble the Sudanese, because they were all Sudanese, it was still one country. So we wrote on the board self-determination. What does that mean? And we literally just went around the room and we had different note takers writing down what it meant. And we literally posted them all around the room. So for some people, self-determination, independence, self-determination, secession, self-determination, insubordination, I mean, you know, everything under the sun. Now, legally, self-determination can mean anything from having the smallest say in your local government all the way up to and including full secession or full independence and everything in between. So one of the things that we tried to do was to get rid of some of the labels. You know, well, we want a federal state, because you can have lots of federal states, we do in the world, and they're all very, very different. So our federalism is not the same as Switzerland or Germany or India, et cetera, but it's our system that works for the way that we were created and built up. Now, we did the same thing with state and religion. These were some of the biggest issues, state and religion, citizenship, because people had been marginalized based on either where they came from, the color of their skin, their tribe, their ethnicity, their religion, and even within the ruling elite of the Arab majority or the Muslim majority, even they had to come from only 3 tribes, or they would never be able to become president. So, I mean, it's the elite of the elite of the elite, and then everybody else is second class, and then the Southerners were like not even class. And so what EGAD tried to do, and it was a very small team of us, was to try to really address some of the core issues, some of the real hard issues that were causing this debilitating war to go on. So we addressed, what does it mean to have a secular state? So secular, what does it mean also to have a religious state? It doesn't matter so much what the religion is, but to have a denominated religion as the national religion of the country, which was Islam. And again, we went around the room, we did the same flip charts and wrote down, you know, some people, secularism, anti-God, anti-belief, you know, so secularism, which a lot of people take to mean, you know, neutral or even-handed, open, whatever, that's not how everybody sees it. And so trying to let people understand, but this is my belief, this is how I see it, and for the other side to be able to hear how the other side hears it and sees it. So, you know, none of them are right or wrong. They're their beliefs, and that's perfectly fine, but they needed to hear what the others felt. But it also allowed especially some of the Southerners, to talk about their experiences of living under an Islamic state, because many of them had been forcibly converted. And in some cases, converted as young adults, which is, you know, quite different from, okay, you're a young, you know, a child, and you're brought up in this religion, you don't necessarily know anything different. That's what you were raised as. But to know that either your parents were Christian or believed in traditional African religions or atheist or agnostic, that was no longer acceptable. They had to be Muslim. And for me, at least as a Catholic, also hearing the Muslims talk about people should just understand all they need is to believe in Allah and the world will be all good. It's like, oh, that's what we say. You know, it's just that we substitute Allah for God. You know, so I mean, it's also eye-opening, I think, for us to hear these things and for us to be challenged. I certainly was. So just fast forward a little bit, and eventually lots of fits and starts, ups and downs, people trying to make more headway on the field than in the negotiating rooms. But again, the opportunity almost closed because now the Darfur war was really spinning out of control, and the Sudanese government was distracted also with Darfur. You had a lot of, the genocide prevention activists going on about Darfur, and so the other parts of the country were also now starting to, that's pretty much done, so let's forget about implementation modalities, let's move on. And I would say that the US government is part and parcel of some of those types of failures, because my boss, General Simbeo, who was running the EGAT mediation, was like, look, if the Americans don't want to support you here anymore, it will be a loss for us, but if we don't have US support, we'll go on, because we need to have implementation modalities, or this peace agreement is not going to work. And of course, all of us know peace agreements without implementation of some sort, they fall apart really quickly. So we managed to get that in, but again, I think this is partly a function of how we sign agreements. The US tends to be very short-sighted. And I think some of this is our budget process. We get confused by our budget cycle and by what our priorities are. So, I can remember a couple of times we would have these meetings with State Department officials or the White House would intervene and say, we need an agreement before the State of the Union address. And, the parties, they're Sudanese. They don't care about the US State of the Union address. So, or other times where all of the observers to the peace process, they're packing up because it's summertime or it's Christmas time, it's vacation. And the Sudanese were like, okay. So, I had sort of no vacations. One year, my whole family, my mom, my dad, I have only one sibling, my older brother, his 3 kids, all of them came to Nairobi to visit me for Christmas. And I'm hanging out in Naivasha with these Sudanese parties trying to make an agreement that's going to last. Rushing back to Nairobi, decorating the Christmas tree. I had my church coming over. We were doing the carols because it was at my house, because I had a nice big house, and I couldn't stay. And I had to rush back. But but we did finally get an agreement, and then of course comes the big burden of trying to implement it. And that's when, as Lori knows, as most of us know, that's when people start fading away, because sort of like, bravo, we got the agreement, woo! And then people start paying less and less attention. And then suddenly the US kind of woke up, and oh my goodness, it's almost time for the referendum on independence. Now, in the meantime, they had elections. The elections were originally scheduled for 2009, postponed to 2010. They had a census, which was supposed to be on which the election would then be based. The census was claimed to be flawed because of the determination of who is really a Southerner, i.e. who's going to vote in the referendum, et cetera. But anyway, it went forward. They had really scam elections. They were terrible. But because so many activists, including the US and US activists and the government, wanted so badly to get to the referendum, where at this point it was pretty clear the Southerners would vote for secession, that they minimized the fraud of the elections. And that sets us up for, how do we behave as, where's our integrity? So that down the line, how do we hold you accountable for what we have not held you accountable for? Like, well, passed muster that time, so we don't have to have free and fair elections, or even anything resembling fair elections, because the big powers didn't mind that we got to this point. But there were lots of milestones that were just not met, including the referendum for Abyei. So they were supposed to have a referendum simultaneous with the referendum for South Sudan. And because of the violence, because of the parties, mostly in this case for Abiy, the government of Sudan, on the national side, not so much the government of national unity, did everything possible to make sure that that referendum would never happen. But again, we went along with it because challenging this was difficult, and it was. The government frequently made us feel guilty about going to Abyei. This is northern territory, but it wasn't. It was disputed territory that was supposed to be resolved by this referendum. And interesting factoid, I don't know if anybody cares, but of the entire peace agreement, the recommendation for the resolution for Abyei was written by the US. And it was presented by the then Special Envoy, Jack Danforth. And it's the one and only piece of the whole peace agreement, of the whole CPA, that is lifted verbatim. And there's actually a footnote, one footnote I allowed to stay in the CPA, that says this is the full unedited version of the text presented to the parties on this date by Special Envoy Jack Danforth. So, but it's also the one that they've completely neglected. So, and I think one of the other issues that I would raise is that we, I believe, have to be careful when we decide we are going to kind of become what they all called us was the midwife of the CPA. So not only did we, I believe it was absolutely necessary, critical for the United States and other major parties to be present, to be observers, to be, you know, on the ground helping the parties, but it was still an EGAD-led process. They needed our money, but they did the mediation. I mean, I was seconded directly to the process. And there were times that General Simbeo would actually send me away because the US was trying to needle me to get information. He was like, no, she works for me. So sometimes he would just have to send me away so that they couldn't get to me to try to, you know, get insider information about what was happening inside. But we really took that on as this is our success. And it was to a certain extent, of course, but it really needed to be the region's success. And I think that was another fault line, because then once the CPA didn't work, or independence now has turned upside down and they've gone back to war, well, it's the US's fault. They mediated this, they midwifed the CPA. Again, yes and no, but ultimately, Lori and I were talking about this morning, a peace agreement can be only implemented only as good or as well as the parties to that agreement, not the mediators or negotiators. It needed to be their agreement to implement. So I'll fast forward a little bit now and talk just briefly about my time as US ambassador. So, so in the meantime, during the peace agreement is signed, I go and work I leave EGAD because there's nothing left. I mean, at that point, we helped them with their first constitutions. And then I was asked to come and head up the rule of law unit for the new peacekeeping mission that was established in Sudan, which had a presence also in South Sudan, in Southern Sudan, but was headquartered in Khartoum. So I did that for 2 years and 4 months, and then went to National Democratic Institute. So at that point, I'd been living overseas in Africa for 15 straight years, and my parents were starting to get antsy that I was never going to come home. And, I was going to live my life out in Africa, far, far away from them. So I went home and let my son actually learn how to speak English and get acclimated to living for the first time in the United States. And my husband as well had never lived in the US. And so we came back and I did that for 2 years, just short of 2 years. I was the head of the I was the regional director for Southern and East Africa. So I kept going back to Sudan and South Sudan and Kenya and all the other countries that I covered. And then I went, after 2 years, I became a Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, and I continued covering Sudan, which then was Sudan and then became South Sudan. I also covered Central Africa and Southern Africa. My friends were like, are there any other gases there? Like, why do you cover practically the whole continent? No, I don't cover East Africa. I don't cover West Africa. It's a big continent. Or as some people say, it's one big country, isn't it? Don't say that. So as a Deputy Assistant Secretary, that's where the policy really happens. And unlike when I was a junior officer, working my way up, both with USAID and with the State Department, in our embassy, you think you're doing great work, and you are doing great work. If there's anything that I learned, it's that people really need to be told that they're appreciated, that their work is good, that, good job, thank you. Because one of the reasons I left was because I never heard it. And then, not that I thought I was doing a bad job, but, you're young at that point. Of course, we think we know it all. It doesn't stop at teenage years, which I know now from my own son. But, you do need to feel like you're appreciated. The shock to me was I came back to Washington and, having been away for all that time, and I find that people have read my cables, and we have a way that it's changed again, but at the time, if it was classified by Susan D. Page, political officer, it meant it was written by Susan Page. Some ambassadors allowed that to happen. Some were like, it was just always classified by the ambassador. My ambassadors were good. We were always credited with what we wrote. And so, I came back and was shocked. What? I might have stayed had I known that you were actually reading my stuff. But lesson learned was that when I became a deputy and when I became an ambassador was to make sure that my people knew that. And I had a great example when I was a deputy. The Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, who's widely respected and well-known throughout sort of the Africanist community, Ambassador Johnny Carson, he made a practice of every promotion cycle, anyone in the African Affairs Bureau who was promoted, he sent them a kudos cable, 1-to-1. Kudos cable is just, congratulations. It's literally a kudos, congrats. And he did that from not, you would think, oh, so he did it for the people at the top level. No, he did it from the people from the lowest to the next, the second to lowest grade promotion, all the way up to the top. And I just thought, I will do that. That is fabulous. So, old dogs can be talking tricks. So that was something that I tried to practice. So fast forward, here I am, the first US ambassador in South Sudan. I'm so excited, even though I had seen what was going on. It was already not going well pre-independence. Not only things that had not been fulfilled from the peace agreement, things that were outstanding that still had to be resolved, but also, again, there were some attempts to do community dialogue, South-South dialogue. In the past, the Catholic Church in particular, but it was under the rubric of the New Sudan Council of Churches, African Council of Churches, and others, but a lot of church leaders, both in the US, but of course in Sudan, Southern Sudan, had been really involved, really engaged on the struggle. And once they got independence, the South Sudanese were like, thank you, we'll take it from here. And they did that with all of us. You could not give them a piece of advice that they would follow. And not to say that, my way is the best way, or there's suggestions, granted. they could not take anything that you suggested, that anyone suggested, and do something about it. And the corruption just flourished, and I became very critical of them. I mean, I'm not known for being a shy diplomat, but what was super helpful to them when I got there, or in the announcement of my confirmation, they were super excited and happy. But then once they started being critical of what they were doing, they didn't like that Susan Page quite so much. But it was necessary if you're going to be, I think, if we're going to be true to ourselves and the standards that we say that we've set. They had a lot to struggle with. Oftentimes in conversation, people would talk about the development of South Sudan, the reconstruction of South Sudan, but it was the construction of South Sudan. There was virtually nothing. There were some remnants of, the colonial government, but buildings that were dilapidated. And the Ministry of Justice in Southern Sudan, before the new building, they still housed prisoners in the actual ministry building. If anybody has done research on the prison conditions in South Sudan, and they often say that the state of a country's democracy is how well they treat their detainees, their prisoners. They're still actually chained. It's really, really abominable. But I tried to do what I could. One thing I was telling Paolo last night, that I questioned whether or not as ambassador I should be going to the Catholic Church, or should I visit all churches so that I would be seen the way that I was seen with respect to other issues. You talk to everybody, you don't make a distinction based on ethnicity or tribe, where they come from, clan, etc. And eventually I just decided, I do have to have something that's just for me. I'm not going as ambassador, even though I can't take off my ambassadorial hat, but I'm going for me and for what I need. But it really helped a lot, because as the conflict unfolded and people started moving into the UN base, which from basically the safe haven of our residential compound, we could see through the cameras the people climbing over the fence and going into the UN base, because it was basically right next to the airport. And as the church leaders became more and more marginalized, even as they tried to help, the president of the country is a well-known Catholic who is, as far as I can tell, it's not up to me to judge, but all of these leaders have serious blood on their hands. And the leaders of the churches writ large were having no influence. So I would go into the IDP camps, the refugee camps, and talk to the people. They, of course, like most of these places, they had developed their own religious ceremonies. So Catholics would have a mass at a certain time, the Episcopals, the other Protestant churches, etc. And I would go and I'd pray with them, and I sent messages, broadcast messages and things like that to give people hope, because it's just, you've been driven out of your home. Nobody does that voluntarily. They were killed. And so it helped, because I was then able to also have that relationship with the church leaders, particularly the Catholic bishops, but others as well, because they knew me to be a person of faith. And I think that was important, because what I realized both in Sudan as well as in South Sudan, it didn't really matter so much what specific faith people had, but they were very much a believing people. And people respected that, even if it was not necessarily their faith. And that I liked even about the Sudanese, so that I remember during the peace talks, the Sudanese had set up a tent that was their prayer mosque, their prayer tent. And my son would come to visit me on the weekends since I really couldn't go home. It was like being a divorced parent. And so he would come and visit me, and one Friday, we'd always take a break for Friday prayers and a break for Sunday prayers. And so my son is there before he had to go back to Nairobi, and he said, I'll do it in English, but Mama, can I go and pray with them? And I was like, absolutely. And so he's like, well, what do I do? And I said, well, I know you have to take your shoes off. And I said, they'll show you, just watch what they do. And I mean, it was a great experience. He was, I think, 6 or 7 at that time. And just to know that this was open. And it helped me as a mediator, because they not only saw me as a mediator or as an American, they saw me as a mother, and they saw me as someone who also respected their beliefs. And I think that was really important. So I'm going to play one little clip. This was my clip of leaving South Sudan. As I said, the war had already broken out. And this is an interview that I gave to Voice of America.
It's really a bittersweet departure. When I arrived here in 2011, only a few months after independence had been declared, and where the new South Sudan flag raised up all over the country, everyone was optimistic. It was vibrant and just lively. Of course, it's really sad to see what's happening right now, where the country is mired in conflict and negotiations are ongoing. So we can only hope that the leaders will take charge and realize what they must do to save their own country and rescue the people of South Sudan.
Thank you.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. I think you can just feel your own.
Yep. Yes. Tell me your name and what you're studying or doing.
My name is Erin. I'm a visiting scholar at the Kellogg Institute, and I'm focused on the Kurdish conflict in the Middle East, but I'm also interested in West Africa. And I was just wondering, just 2 things real quick. From what I've heard, that during that time and later on as well, the IGAD mediation team was actually quite weak and under severe pressure as well from external interests wanting the peace agreement to be shaped in a particular way. I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And also, was John Garang pro-unity actually? Because that's what I've heard. And finally, what are your views on the current success prospects of the current peace agreement in South Sudan?
So I'll start with John Garang. There is a room for fair debate about whether he was pro-unity or pro-secession. Obviously, we will never really know. When the SPLM came out of the support that they got from the Derg and kind of this very sort of communist leaning, they'd gotten a lot of their training in Cuba, following these sorts of revolutionary models. When they came to the US the first time, the Americans were like, oh, heck no. We are not about to support some, neo-communist movement under the rubric of a liberation movement for the people of Sudan. So there's a wide amount of belief that John Garang really did want secession, but knew that that would not be acceptable, especially because the longstanding tradition under the African Union Charter about not recognizing new country boundaries, borders. So accepting the borders that were drawn up after the war, after World War I. And so some say that that was a smart diplomatic move, that if he had tried to push secession in a new country, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. Others say that he really was, I don't want to label it in quite the same way, but a unifier, a Martin Luther King Jr. type of speaker, in the sense that I want a new Sudan that is modeled on equality, based on citizenship, based on rights, based on sort of a constitutional order that everyone is equal. It's hard to know how much of that is accurate, but I think it was very clear while we were negotiating, even from the early days, there were plenty of people on this SPLM delegation who were like, if John Garang doesn't want to vote, doesn't want secession, he will have to get a passport to visit us in our new country. I mean, there have been studies, NDI actually did a focus group on that. And that was the clear result, was that they wanted independence, secession. I mean, it was phrased in secession terms, but on the other hand, he probably thought, especially with the welcome that he received in 2005 when he went to Khartoum and was sworn in as the first vice president, that he could maybe actually win. I don't think that that's true, but only because I think it would have been very difficult, no matter what, for the country to have voted for a non-Muslim. Even as charismatic as he was, and he did have a vision, he had a view. But again, we don't know. He was killed 20 days after he was sworn in. In terms of IGAD, so this is the thing. IGAD was, I think, particularly strong during the CPA period, but it was a different IGAD. And it was, at that time, allowed to be the Secretariat on Peace in Sudan, established in Kenya with Kenyan mediation. But again, it was, within the context, it was a moment in time where really the signals were all there for an opportunity to make peace. When the conflict broke out in December of 2013, it was very different, because the government was promoting a certain rhetoric that this was an attempted coup, and they literally went out and started killing anybody who was a Nuer, and because they just decided anybody who's Nuer automatically must support Riek Machar. That's largely how the conflict escalated and became very ethnicized. Then you had, first it was going to be Kenyan mediation, then it was, no, it's going to be Ethiopian mediation, and Ethiopia basically said, we're the chair of IGAD, and had been for some time at that point, and we're not giving it up, because IGAD was their baby. And so it then did end up being led by Ethiopia with Seymour Mesfin. He knew a lot about the history of South Sudan, of course, or Sudan in general, but he was, in my view, not a very effective mediator. It was a series of one-on-one individual meetings, which you do have to do sometimes if that's necessary, but very few opportunities for the parties to come together and discuss and debate amongst themselves about what was the cause, what did they want, was it within the SPLM, was it, personality clash? So that, I think, was a problem, and yes, all of these countries were way too vested. The South Sudanese, I used to tell my new embassy staff, I want you on a Friday to take one of the drivers and go to the airport. Just sit there for a few minutes. You will see all of the leadership going through this airport, getting on the plane to go spend their weekend in Kampala or in Nairobi. A few going to Ethiopia, but by and large, they had massive houses, cars, all of their kids studied there. I've never seen anything like that in a post-conflict setting where you don't want to build your own country. I can see having an investment somewhere else in case things go belly up. That's fine. But all of your children are being educated in these two other countries. Your partner's spouses don't live with you. They're also either in that country or somewhere else. And the last thought that they seemed to have was, oh, maybe I should build a tukul, a small home for my elderly mother who sacrificed everything so that I could get an education. Not on their agenda at all. And it just still to this day amazes me how you could spend so much time and money, even though it wasn't their own, building up the economy of another place instead of your own. Having said that, it's one of the reasons I think that the prospects for peace are really quite dim. There's no real reconciliation process. The South Sudanese, and with all of President Kiir's faults, the one thing he has been very clear on is that he himself is traumatized. Now, he won't say, I need to go and have mental health therapy, because that's not something that's not really in their society, but he recognizes that it's a society that is marred in trauma. And you don't get over that in a decade. And because there has never been, for such a long time, I mean, probably if you read like Douglas Johnson, maybe since the One-Lit Triangle discussions where you had some actual real community peace building, individual efforts in certain places have taken place, but not on the wider scale. The churches have been trying to do that, kind of under the agape theme of love. But it's hard because, again, people want, they want quick fixes. And as we've seen more recently, trauma is not something you get over fast and can be inherited and passed down. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Tommy Tilavia. I'm a lawyer from Uganda. I'm here for my master's degree in international human rights law. My question is generally related to your work, South Sudan, but also about Libya, because the situation in Libya is very much similar to what we had in Darfur and in South Sudan. So as a top US diplomat, how could you explain the change of US policy from peace to use of force in Libya? And maybe how did you feel at that time, especially that the African Union, as a bloc, was very clear that they did not really want to see any foreign intervention in Libya?
That's a hard one, and it's hard because what's clear is that no two countries are treated equally. Well, of course, that makes sense. I mean, we can't be involved everywhere, so you have to literally pick and choose your battles. For me, what was surprising was that I remember the exact date of the vote of the Security Council resolution. I was going for my last briefings before I went out to South Sudan. Excuse me, and I'd gone into a set of meetings, and I'm listening to the radio, to NPR as I'm going out there, and it was clear we were not going to vote for intervention. We weren't going to try to overthrow Gaddafi. I came out from the CIA about 5 hours later, and we had. And I have to admit, I was actually stunned. And this is where I think, I don't like to be overly critical of any one individual because we could all make similar choices that didn't turn out so well. But I think the reality is that we give token appreciation of the African Union, but we don't really buy into their views, or we don't take their views as being what we should actually do. So on the one hand, we say, well, they've told us African solutions for African problems, and so we respect that, because it kind of gets us a little bit off the hook. They want to solve their own problems, but it's also because they know they're going to want to keep each other in power. They're not going to intervene in Burundi the way that needs to be done. They're not going to, you know, Museveni has been saying for how many years he wants to pull out of supporting the attempt to get the Lord's Resistance Army. No, 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 this is now our priority. I mean, so that means he keeps getting equipment and military assistance and et cetera, et cetera. So you know, when I look at even the architecture, the peace and security architecture, and you've got the African Union, you have this in other regions of the world as well, but ECOWAS, which is a really strong, or stronger, probably the strongest of the regional, sub-regional bodies in Africa. You have IGAD, which until the CPA had never played any sort of a deployment as IGAD. I mean, they had under, you know, East African forces and things like that. But we did it in Iraq. I don't know, maybe we just didn't learn a lesson. So we decided we'd try the same tactic in Libya, and look what we have in both countries. So I don't really have a great answer, but I can tell you one of the repercussions though was that not so much to the intervention in Libya, but afterwards when our ambassador was killed and the security team, I didn't yet at that point, our embassy in Juba did not have Marines. I got Marines pretty darn quickly, and I had a reinforced security team because, you know, an ambassador had been killed. And of course, the State Department takes these things very seriously, as we should. Nobody wants, and it played out further when we started talking about whether or not we should keep the embassy open after the war started, or should we close? And all embassies have an evacuation order and a plan for how they're going to do it if necessary, with benchmarks. And they made me go even further than what was in our security plan, because they were so worried. And we literally, I've never seen anything like this, where around the room on secure video and audio calls, where literally the heads of all of these departments, I mean, defense, CIA, state, USA, I mean, it was all around the room voting on whether or not we should close the embassy or keep it open. So all of these things, you know, have consequences when you look back, unfortunately. So I don't have an answer except to say that, yeah, I thought it was the wrong thing, but, you know, they would have said, yeah, and is your mandate the National Security Council, or is it the embassy in Juba?
Yeah. Thank you. My name is Fidelis Olukumoro. I'm from Nigeria.
You forgot the first part of your name, Father.
Yes. Thank you. Just to, before my questions, just to add to it for those who may not know, before the invasion of Libya, Libya had the highest level of literacy in Africa. And about 2 years ago, you have slavery going on in Libya. Yeah. Just for you to know what has changed since the invasion of Libya by the US. My question is that you made reference to the fact that conflict don't just happen, they build up with time, which is which is a reality. And one of the things that we have noticed that, which you may also be aware of, which you will be aware is that one of the factors that influence conflict in many parts of Africa is a land issue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the land issue is not just any land. The fight and conflict over the green space. Mm-hmm. So, being a former U.S. ambassador, you know, in South Sudan, and considering the U.S. policy, present policy of the withdrawal from the climate issue, you know, if you were to be in South Sudan right now as a U.S. ambassador, you know, having realized that one of the problems is land degradation and conflict over the green space. Mm-hmm. You know, how would you have dealt with that situation, considering the fact that your country, you know, doesn't presently believe, you know, in the climate problem, so to speak? You know, that's one side of the story. The other question is also that when you engage in peace process, do you consult or do you adopt local process of peaceful, you know, resolution? Do you adopt local process of conflict resolution? Mm-hmm. You know, just like you said, conflict don't just happen, they build up with time. Also, those people who have been and who are not enemies to themselves may also have an history of relationship.
Right.
Are those things considered? You know, are there ways in which you go into, you know, the history to pull out, you know, and to adopt processes with which they've settled conflicts in the past?
Yeah, you know, for me, I think it's really important to know the history, and without knowing really what I was getting myself into when I accepted to, you know, to go and help with this peace process. I mean, I was serious about, well, I don't know very much about Sudan. And I mean, I respect my former boss, you know, this kind of flippant, you know, you'll be okay. I mean, I did try to read as much as possible, but 2 weeks, you know, I mean, come on, you can't read about the history of a country in 2 weeks. So a lot of it was also learning as I went, meeting and talking to different people who had, you know, many, many, many more years of experience with the history of the country in general. But I do think this is something that we don't do very well, is often with peace processes, we look to former heads of state, former prime ministers, former, you know, bigwigs, which can be great in the sense of, okay, we've got some heft, somebody who's going to get recognition, so can call on other world leaders because he or she has been at that level. But they don't necessarily, A, know how to mediate or know mediation techniques. They don't necessarily know the history just because they're a leader from some other country. I mean, so I don't think we do that very well, is to know what has worked. That's why I referred to, I mean, some of the historians and others that I met through the Sudan peace process, the Douglas Johnsons, I mean, there are plenty, I mean, but who, you know, at one point during the conflict, USAID brought in, well, actually it was before the war broke out, but conflicts in a particular region in the Jonglei area, Pibor in particular, and it was a couple of different ethnic groups that were fighting, raiding children, wives, etc. And you needed to know, I needed to know more about what is the underlying conflict here? Why are these particular groups fighting? And USAID brought in a couple of anthropologists who had studied in particular the Murle. And I learned, wow, the Murle fight as an age set. So the people that they went through the initiation rites together with, that's their age set, and that's with whom they fight. So they wouldn't be fighting against a different, I mean, with a different age set. They fight with each other. to go against another group. So it's things like that, you know, I think if I had my way, I would try to ensure that not just peace processes, but even our diplomats have a more rounded out background. It's starting to get that way, but we need some specialists. The hard part is that, you know, you're not supposed to get clientitis. You're not supposed to be in a country too long, so that disincentivizes somebody from having a specific in-depth knowledge of country X, Y, Z, or a particular, you know, tribe or whatever. So I don't think that we have really mastered that. I think some individuals do it better than others, either because of their own background knowledge or their own wisdom. But others might have absolutely no idea that there is even a tradition. But just lastly, to answer your last question, I think although the Trump administration has signaled that it plans to withdraw from the climate change agreement, you know, it still hasn't yet taken effect since it's a 3-year process to disengage. And the one thing that does give me some hope is that the states, many of the states of the US have said, no, we're going to follow this. We're still going to do it. Now, granted, yes, it's not at the national level, but so far, I haven't actually seen it play out on the ground. And I think that's a positive thing, that it hasn't yet stopped our diplomacy from being what it is. But in places like South Sudan, it's all sorts of, it's not just land and water, it's resources in general, and the limited resources, the cattle, you know, cattle raiding, things like that. But let me go over here, sorry. I'll wait for you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Caroline Hughes. I'm a professor in the Crop Institute. I mainly work on Southeast Asia, so my knowledge of Sudan is fairly superficial. But so I wanted to ask actually a more sort of abstract question, which is that you've talked a lot very interestingly about the different kinds of timescales involved in peace building. So the sort of historical origins of conflicts and the time involved in things like trauma healing, and how different that is from the time scale of a White House news cycle or something. And obviously peace building is sort of a many layered activity with lots of different timescales involved. And I wondered what does that sort of suggest? How do you try to pull those things together when you yourself are working for an organisation which has a different timescale again? I mean, what are the sort of ethical problems of being involved in a society that's living with it for the long term, and you're sort of working to a society with a different set of time frames, and how do you try to deal with those in a productive way?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me personally, I think just knowing individuals has helped me to at least understand it better. Also, the fact that we live in a world where it is certainly much more acceptable to, you know, seek therapy. Doesn't mean everybody is comfortable doing it, but it is much more common if you look at, you know, the statistics today. But I've also been really lucky that I've had mostly supervisors, bosses, colleagues that I've been able to talk to and, you know, reason with and say, I'm sorry, but I don't really think the South Sudanese or the Sudanese care all that much about the State of the Union address. I mean, can't you use some other example of success? We're not there yet. So, you know, that helps. And sometimes, I mean, I have stepped aside from working on an issue where the State Department saw it one way and I didn't agree. And I agreed with the Assistant Secretary. Well, I mean, if I'm pressed, of course, I will say this, you know, the department line, but I know legally we didn't do the right thing, and he allowed me to basically recuse myself from that. Okay, yes. Well, no, but I used to cover it. Habari yako?
So I have two questions, and the first one is actually from a statement that you just said when you were answering Fidelis' question. I'm just like him. And you say if you had your way or suggested things differently. Because as you were talking, at some point I get to hear something like certain agreements have to happen in order to keep a certain state of the nation at rest. Yeah. Or some things have to happen so that certain policies of the United States will be fulfilled or something like that. And my question is, when do you cross the line to say, after I spent so much time here and knowing how the logistics work here, this is what I would suggest, even if it's completely against what maybe the US government policies would suggest about making these peace agreements on an area like Sudan. So I just wanted to know your personal, where do you draw the line to say this is what I'm convinced and this is how it's going to work? Second question.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'm doing my research right now. It's in Christology.
Yeah.
I'm studying some of these integrated communities, and we have a couple of these in Tanzania, because Tanzania giving citizenship to some of the refugees who have come from all these different countries. And somehow some of these have come together for a decade or two, and they've formed these very wonderful integrated communities. But when you spend so much time with them, at some point they go back 20 years ago and they remember what happened. And they talk about who intervened and who didn't intervene. And my question here is, how does the US government choose where to intervene and where not to intervene? Because we have a number of communities that are troubled in the continent of Africa. And I'm wondering if it worked in Sudan, or maybe somehow you wanted to, there was a kind of trying to force an agreement, a peaceful agreement in Sudan. Why didn't it work in Somalia? Or why didn't it work in Rwanda or Burundi or Congo, in what is happening right now?
Okay, so I'm going to start with your last question first. So I would say that this is where I think context matters and history matters. So I'm going to use the example of Rwanda. So lots of stuff has gone on since colonial times in Rwanda. How the Tutsi were, considered sort of the elite and better, smarter, whatever, and how that then reverberates then and later. But at the same time, in the lead up to the genocide in 1994, because we often, Rwanda came to the world's attention in 1994, because everyone was watching, CNN was brand new, over and over and over again, the same clips of the same people with, their mattresses on their backs and the bags on their head, trekking, across to DRC. But they had an agreement. They actually had a peace agreement that, fragile, not necessarily working very well, the Arusha Accords, but Rwanda was also on the Security Council at the time. So how do you then decide? It's hard to look another leader in the face and not believe him or her, even when you know the contrary is happening. Because I think because I've sat in on several meetings with my ambassador or myself where a leader is lying to your face. It's really hard though. What do you do? Look, you are telling a bold-faced lie. You have to be pretty careful about how you go about that. But being on the Security Council at that time, Rwanda was also at that time, even though this is, the genocidal government, they were also the darling of the development community at the time. But we don't remember that because A, we're ignorant of history. We don't even know our own history. How are we going to learn somebody else's? And B, we don't have historians or academics working with us, let's say as diplomats or whatever, to help inform us So when we then get information from prominent activists or actors or whatever, we're not necessarily inclined to believe that, this is a rabble rouser, or this one is, you know, somebody who would find a war in a, you know, bowl of soup. I mean, you know, so I think it's a question of every country has to decide based on its own national interests. And at the time, would the US have said Rwanda is in our national interests? And I don't say that lightly, but as you say, we can't intervene everywhere. So you take a country like Rwanda at the time, we didn't receive any of their imports. They exported nothing to us. They didn't have, I mean, small population, small land mass atrocities going on. Do you intervene? Is that the standard? If so, why aren't we everywhere, literally, including, you know, in our own backyards? So I don't have a good answer other than to say it depends on who's in power. It depends on how the national security agencies, along with the Defense Department and the State Department, have defined national security threats and the foreign policy agenda. And, you know, they also didn't want to intervene in Kosovo. But there was a lot of protest from diplomats themselves who resigned en masse, saying this is what's going on, and us not calling it what it is, a genocide, I can't stand for it. And so sometimes that's what shakes it up. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Why don't we take one more? Maybe we're out of time.
So the last remark that you made in your comments on your way out of South Sudan, you said that I hope that we'll do something for the South Sudanese people, right?
I hope the leaders will do something.
I hope the leaders will do something for the South Sudanese. Nobody who's in leadership was born South Sudanese. There's no national identity. There's no national history. The only thing that caused them to be unified was that they shared an enemy, which they, you know, legislatively or juridically dispatched. What is it that it should be, that we should be looking for as the basis for a prospect for peace going forward if there's no identity, history, pattern of cooperation? What's the thing that we can be working on to build that might in some way invite peace in the future?
I actually do think it has to go back down to the grassroots. They do have a history as Southern Sudanese, or if you want to say as Sudanese, of having some peace building at the local grassroots level. So, I mean, there's been South-South dialogue, there's been the One Lit Triangle dialogue, there've been conferences, they've got Bishop Paride Taban, who has his own sort of peace center. I think it has to be about that. But the hardest part is we can't define what it means to be South Sudanese. And they're really struggling to come up with an identity. As you say, I mean, that's their identity, you know, we're not the Jalaba. But when I heard people say to me, and I'm sorry, just use that term, that's the term they use, but when they would say to me, even the Jalaba, meaning the Arabs, even the Jalaba didn't treat us like this. Meaning our own people are treating us worse than the country we seceded from for treating us so badly. You know, what do you do when what do you call it? You know, the downtrodden become the torturers, or the, so I think the only real option is, I believe there have to be, again, these local traditions. I mean, they do have traditional judges. They've been undermined. It's not to say that everything that they did was always necessarily respectful of some of the international human rights bodies, but they were trying to make decisions in the governance of their bodies. And sometimes it was different tribes, but they would go to the traditional chiefs to adjudicate, okay, you stole 20 of my cattle, that's my wealth. And you stole some of my children and wife, so I want compensation for that. Well, you know, I can't give you your cattle back because it's already been whatever has happened to it, but I can order that you now sell 20 of your cattle and give that family the money. Or I can say, all right, this may not be satisfactory to us in the Western world, but you now have, okay, I mean, we can't give the children back, it's been 10 years or whatever it's been, but we can have bride price paid so that at least the other party is made whole.
Or we can
So
give you a couple
equity.
of girls. They'll give them a couple of girls.
No, they don't usually do it that way, but again, I mean, I think it goes back to some of those traditions, but if we don't know what they are, this is where I think if we could get the historians, the anthropologists, the others who know about those traditions, and they're dying off. There just aren't that many of them because there's so many conflicts around the world. But if we could get some of them to work with governments to say, we should be outsiders, but can we help them logistically bring people together? I think that would be a good step. Well, I want to thank you all very much for listening, and I wish you all the best of luck and success. And yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Dean's.
But I have seen your photo. How are you?
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you so much.